Welcome to this explainer. You can think of today's session as a masterclass in environmental cause and effect. I am so thrilled to guide you through this because when we look at human development, whether we're building a new power plant, expanding a massive highway, or setting up an industrial estate, the consequences rarely just stop at the edge of the construction site. Human projects cascade through the natural world in some incredibly profound and often invisible ways. So today, we're going to put on our detective hats. We're going to trace these complex pathways from the very first interaction all the way to the far-reaching, totally unexpected consequences. Let's dive right into our rigorous analysis of the ripple effect. Here's our roadmap for today. We'll start with a quick introduction to the main categories of impacts before unpacking direct impacts. Then we'll move into the fascinating world of indirect and socioeconomic impacts, followed by cumulative impacts. Finally, we'll scale our perspective from local to global and summarize everything we've learned. All right, let's jump straight into Section 1, Introduction to Environmental Impacts. When environmental scientists and planners conduct an environmental impact assessment, they don't just look for one obvious type of damage. No, they have to categorize the ripples to truly understand them. So, they break down environmental consequences into 4 distinct buckets. First, we have direct impacts, which are basically the immediate effects. Second, indirect impacts, which are the secondary ripples. Then we have cumulative impacts, looking at the aggregate effect over a timeline. And finally, induced impacts, which encompass the broader societal and infrastructural shifts. By segmenting the impacts exactly like this, scientists make sure that literally no stone is left unturned when they're evaluating a brand new project. Okay, moving on to Section 2, Direct Impacts Explained.
You can think of a direct impact as the first strike. It's the immediate, highly tangible interaction between a human activity and the environment. Now, the strict academic definition is an impact that occurs through the direct interaction of an activity with an environmental, social, or economic component. But the absolute keyword to remember here is interaction. There's no middleman whatsoever. The project happens and the environment is immediately and directly altered by that specific activity. It's a straight, unbreakable line between cause and effect.
To really ground this definition, let's look at a practical, real-world example. Imagine a large industrial estate. The waste from these factories goes into an ETP, an effluent treatment plant. When that ETP discharges its treated, or let's be real, sometimes partially treated water, directly into a local river, it causes a direct impact on the water quality. Specifically, you're going to see a massive spike in BOD, or biological oxygen demand. For those who might be a bit rusty, BOD simply measures how much oxygen bacteria will consume while breaking down organic waste. A high BOD means the bacteria are basically hogging all the oxygen. And consequently, this leads right into our second effect, altered DO, or dissolved oxygen. The fish and the aquatic life desperately need that dissolved oxygen to survive. Combine this oxygen starvation with the direct introduction of water toxins, and boom, you have a textbook first-strike direct impact on a local ecosystem. Let's get into Section 3, Indirect and Socioeconomic Impacts. Now, what's really fascinating here is that environmental issues rarely just stop at that first strike. Why? Because an ecosystem is exactly that. It's a highly interconnected system. And this brings us right to indirect impacts. These are the secondary or even third-level impacts on the environment that aren't actually a direct result of the project itself. They're often produced geographically far away from the source, or they happen as a result of a highly complex impact pathway. Because they don't happen immediately or even in the exact location of the project, they require some seriously skilled planners to predict them. Let's trace one of these chemical pathways together. It's pretty wild. Consider an industrial smokestack releasing SO2, sulfur dioxide, into the ambient air. Now, the direct impact is simply poor air quality right around the stack, but the indirect impact happens when that SO2 travels up through the atmosphere, oxidizes and deposits miles and miles away on agricultural land as SO4, sulfate. This chemical transformation actually causes acidic soils, completely ruining crop yields far away from the original pollution source. The soil wasn't directly touched by the factory, yet it was poisoned by it through this invisible atmospheric pathway. And this brilliantly illustrates an even more complex, multi-tiered ripple effect. Let's talk about thermal pollution. Step 1. A nearby industry discharges cooling water into a lake. It's just water, sure, but it's warm water. The direct impact is a simple, measurable rise in the overall water temperature. Step 2. That temperature change negatively affects the aquatic flora, the plants living in the water. That's a secondary, indirect impact. Step 3. Because the flora is dying off, the fish populations that rely on those plants begin to drop. And then Step 4, which is probably the most profound, that reduction in fishing harvests heavily impacts the income of the local fishermen. We have just traced a direct line from slightly warm water to human poverty.
In the academic literature, this final step is characterized as a socioeconomic third-level impact.
It's important to note that indirect impacts also encompass what we call growth-inducing impacts. When you build a massive infrastructure project, say a brand new power plant, it acts like a giant magnet. It induces changes to land use patterns. Almost overnight, you need additional road networks just to service the plant. This influx brings in workers, fundamentally altering the population density and the entire growth rate of what might have been a quiet area. And as this new town springs up, it brings its own subsequent disruptions to the air, the water, and the natural ecosystems. The power plant didn't directly build those roads or bring in those cars, but it induced the environment that did.
Moving forward, Section 4, Understanding Cumulative Impacts.
So having looked at how impacts spread geographically and chemically, we absolutely must zoom out and look at how impacts aggregate across a timeline. This brings us to the concept of cumulative impacts. Listen, an ecosystem doesn't care if pollution comes from one project or 10 different projects. Cumulative impacts occur when the incremental impact of a single project being evaluated is combined with the effects of all the other projects. And crucially, this includes past projects, present projects, and reasonably foreseeable future projects. If a river is already stressed to the max by 50 years of historic industrial runoff, a new factory's relatively small direct impact might just be the tipping point that destroys the river entirely when you view it through a cumulative lens.
Now for Section 5, Global versus Local Scales. The crucial point we need to make here is contrasting the physical reach of the pollution. Environmental science distinguishes between two major scales of impact based entirely on the pollutant type. On one side, we have local pollutants. These cause localized impacts, affecting only the immediate surrounding environment. That's like the warm cooling water we discussed earlier. But on the other side, we have global pollutants. These cause impacts on a literal planetary scale, affecting areas vastly far away from the place of generation. Think about greenhouse gases. The carbon dioxide emitted from a single smokestack mixes into the global atmosphere, contributing to climate change that might cause sea level rise on a different continent entirely. Ultimately, the scale of the impact always dictates the scale of the necessary mitigation.
And finally, Section 6, Summary of Impact Pathways.
Well, we have covered an immense amount of ground in this explainer today, journeying all the way from a single immediate drop of industrial effluent to global, compounding, cumulative changes over time. By breaking down impacts into direct, indirect, cumulative, and induced categories, we really begin to appreciate the staggering responsibility of environmental planning. Every single action triggers a reaction, whether chemically, biologically, or socioeconomically, which leaves us with a pretty provocative thought. As we map these incredibly complex causal pathways, from sulfur dioxide transforming up in the clouds all the way to the dropping incomes of local fishermen, how can an environmental planner possibly foresee all of those third-level induced socioeconomic impacts before the very first stone of a project is even cast? It demands rigorous science, it demands deep foresight, and above all, a profound respect for the interconnectedness of our world. Thank you so much for joining me in this masterclass, and keep questioning the ripples around you.